Hi, Kathy. It's great to see you again.
Great to see both of you, as you, my favorite people. Love seeing both of you.
Great.
And thank you for having me. No, I really, really appreciate this. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Well, last time, Kathy, we talked about how you shared the nature of thought or how our thinking works with inmates and with engineers and health professionals, and how that led to insights that really changed their lives and increase their productivity and everything. I wonder if you could explain a little bit about the difference between having an insight and gaining more information.
Oh, wow. That's a 3-day training. Okay, okay. Um, well, okay, there is a difference, and maybe the best way to I could talk about this, like when we were teaching the principles in the jail system, we were in the context of a program called Regimented Corrections Program. It was like a therapeutic boot camp in a jail, okay? And so in this program, they had 12-step, they had cognitive behavioral, they had uh, sexual trauma, they had, other courses. Uh, and then we were one of those courses. So most of them were information based, like in 12-step, you have to do these things. These are the steps. Cognitive behavioral, you want to see what you're thinking, you want to change it, you want to reframe it. Um, and sexual trauma, that was the one that really had the most impact as far as we could see is you need to go back into your past and remember your trauma and then talk about it in the present. So they were getting all these classes, and then, we were part of the classes. So there are two situations where it was obvious that we were very different. Okay. The first one was when we were teaching the inmates the principles. And at one point they said, you guys are telling us the opposite of everything else we're learning in these other classes.
Mm.
And so that told me that they were on to the principles, that they saw the difference. And so I said, well, what do you mean this is different? And they said, well, like you're telling us it's okay to have any thoughts because the way thoughts are, they can't hurt you. They can't get you into trouble if you kind of know what the deal is. But this other class, they tell us, first of all, not to have certain thoughts, that if we have certain thoughts about using drugs, that we need to quickly not have that thought. And they said, but what happens is as soon as we're told not to have the thought, we end up having it more. And I said, yeah, it's kind of funny how that works, It's like somebody putting a piece of candy on a table and it's your favorite kind of candy and they leave you alone with the candy and they tell you, listen, that's for somebody else, so please don't eat the candy. And you're sitting there and the more you think about not eating the candy, at some point that candy is going to end up in your mouth, you know, or you'll take a bite out of it or something. So, but they started to see the difference. Or in with men who have to go through a 12-month program called anger management. And one guy in one of my classes in the jail, he said, most of us have been through this anger management because they were abusive to their wives or girlfriends. We have to go through this 12-month program. And one guy goes, yeah, that's why I'm back in jail. I said, well, why would that be? He said, well, that class made me so angry, it made it worse for me. True story. So I can't help laughing. But he said, now the way you talk about anger, it's like so the opposite of the way they talk about anger. And it doesn't make me angry anymore. And so this is how I knew the difference from what they told us. So another I'm trying to think of another situation where we were talking about the nature of thought versus doing something with thought. And I think most of us in our lives are kind of trying to do that ourselves. We're trying to have different thinking. Like somehow we think if we have certain thoughts, well, we shouldn't have them. And we judge ourselves, or we try to not to have them, or we try to override them. I mean, we're always trying to do something with our thinking. And you could manage that. I mean, cognitive behavioral is very helpful. Um, Different approaches can be very helpful for people to have insights about their situation or their issues, but it doesn't sustain them because they don't know the nature of why that helped them. Why is it that, um, well, I go to 12 step, and when I'm in the meeting, I feel great and I feel positive and I feel optimistic that I'll never use again. But Cathy, 3 days after the meeting, that's gone. And I start thinking about I want to use again. So I better go back to the meeting. So in their mind, the meeting is really helping them, which is true to an extent. And I'm grateful that there are 12-step meetings all over the place. I mean, if there weren't, we'd have a lot more people dying, as far as I'm concerned. So I would ask myself, well, all right, let's look at that. So you go into a good feeling when you're in the meeting. I said, now, why do you think that is? And they kind of get reflective, and they're like, well, because the people who are sharing, it's like I don't feel so alone anymore. That I'm not the only one that's going through this. And boy, that's a relief. So I start to feel relief, and then, okay. So what else do you feel? Well, the more people share, it's like we all feel like we're like one big family, and we accept each other and we love. I mean, Cathy, it's really awesome. I said, great. Okay, so now when you leave the meeting, where does that feeling go? And they're like, well, what do you mean, where does the feeling go? I said, well, yeah, where does that good feeling go? I don't know. I said, oh, okay. Well, would you like to know? Well, yeah. And then I talk about, well, actually, that good feeling that they have isn't coming from the meeting. They slip into it and they assign it to the meeting, but that good feeling is with them, whether they're in a meeting, they're not in a meeting. Even when they were out there using drugs, that place was still there. And now we're talking about mind, we're talking about this universal intelligence, we're talking about limitless potential, spiritual, whatever you want to call that, the formless, that's in us no matter what. And they're like, nobody tells us this. I mean, it's like, well, it's conditional. Like, well, I can get there. I have to do all this stuff to get there. And I'm saying, no, you're there already. You don't have to do all this stuff to get there. And then I had them reflect on when they have gotten there without doing anything. Well, let's look at it in your own life. I'm not here to convince you. Are there times when you're just in a good feeling, and you were just in a good feeling for no other reason? And they were able to remember times when that happened, even the inmates in jail. One day I said, they thought I was nuts. I said, is there a time while you're locked up in jail that you forget you're locked up? And they're like, Cathy, that's a stupid question. How could we forget we're locked up? Yeah, and this is high secure unit, right? They don't see the light of day. Bars on their. I mean, you're in a prison or in a jail setting. I said, no, really. Let's look at that. Even if it's a moment, are there times when you literally forget you're locked up in jail? And they kind of got quiet. And one guy goes, you know what? Yeah, there has been a time. I said, well, tell me, when was the time? He said, well, there's a group of us, about 3 or 4 guys. We play this card game. We have a card game. And when we're playing cards, it's like we're not locked up. We're just playing cards. I could be in my backyard. He said, Cathy, you're right. When we're playing cards together, everything else disappears and we're just in the game. I said, awesome. Another guy goes, well, believe it or not, in the morning when I wake up, I pray. I said, oh, well, what do you mean? Well, I pray to God. I said, well, what happens when you pray to God? Well, this amazing feeling of peace comes over me when I'm praying to God. So when I'm praying to God, I don't realize I'm locked up. And so again, well, what happened to your mind? Your mind just cleared completely and you're completely open. And a number of the other ones that share the same thing because they all pray. It's amazing. When you get locked up, you pray. But again, so they tell me what the difference is. And there's one cute story. So there's one gentleman, he's in jail. He's an inmate in this high secure unit. And he said, Cathy, when I'm locked up, Jesus is with me. I'm so close to Jesus. I just feel him and I just feel amazing and I feel spiritual and I just feel like I'm back to being myself again. I mean, he just talks about how wonderful it is. He said, but when I get out of jail, could you explain this to me? Why does Jesus leave me when I get out of jail? I said, well, what do you mean? Well, he leaves me. As soon as I'm out of jail, he's gone. And now I do bad things and I end up back in jail again. And then I get him back. Then I get Jesus back again. And he said, you know what? I actually sometimes want to be locked up so I can be close to Jesus. And I thought, he said, so Cathy, why is that? And I'm just laughing inside. I'm like, I said, well, there is a reason. I can explain it to you. And he says, well, please do, because I really don't understand it. So I said, well, when you're here in jail, when you feel good, why do you think you feel good? Like, why do you think you feel good when you're locked up? He said, well, I don't have to worry about stuff anymore. I don't have to worry about making money. I don't have to worry about dealing with my relationships. I don't have to worry. Now I'm locked up. I have an excuse. I don't have to, I'm not available. And a few other guys are like, yeah, that's true, Cathy. Because I'm thinking that would be my worst nightmare to be locked up, right? No, for them, it's kind of like a vacation, as bizarre as that sounds. Yeah. And I said, okay. So you feel relieved and you feel less pressure. So yeah, of course you start to feel lighter, right? He said, yeah. And then I start talking to Jesus and I feel even better and better. I said, so when you leave, when you get out, what's the first thing that happens when you walk outside that door? Or even so, how about a few days before you get out? What starts to happen? And he said, I have to deal with facing reality. I said, well, what is reality? Well, my parole officer, my wife and the kids. I mean, so actually, do you think Jesus is leaving you, or do you think it's something else? And he said, now that you mention it, I said, you're doing that. See, Jesus is still there, but you're burying him. You're just burying him. And so when you go back to jail, guess what happens? You don't have to worry anymore. And Jesus comes back. Do you see how that works? And he's like, oh my God. I mean, it literally blew him away. He said, is that what's been going on this whole time? I said, yeah, that's what's been going on. So yeah, the difference between understanding the nature of thought and that it's just coming through us versus taking it as truth, taking it as something solid, taking it as something that I need to do something with. I mean, that to me is the difference between information, data, concrete, and we do need to know stuff. I mean, yes, when you get out of jail, you do need to do things to get back on your feet. You need to know how to get a job. You need to know maybe stick with the psychiatrist to stay on your medication. So there are things you need to do that's informational. But if your mind's like totally in overwhelm, then even doing that stuff isn't going to hang. You won't have enough room in your mind to even deal with that stuff. So yes, information is important, but if you don't have this understanding of how using thought to deal with all that information, see, that to me is the difference and helping them understand. And they picked up on it on their own when they said, you guys, this is the opposite. And I'm like, oh, they're onto it. The other thing I say to them, I said, now here's the thing. I don't want to say we're right and they're wrong either. Because if you were listening in your other classes, listen to the heart of what they're pointing to. Go to this, what are they pointing you to? When they're telling you, well, you shouldn't have certain kinds of thinking, well, what are they really saying? They're saying, well, thinking can get you into trouble. But if you know what thought is, then it won't get you into trouble. You don't have to manage it, but it's still good to know, oh, why am I having all this thinking about using drugs now? What's up with that? So it's good to notice that and understand, well, obviously, if you've been using drugs for 20 years, it's inevitable a thought about using drugs is going to come through. In fact, you can count on it. So it's just having those kinds of discussions is, to me, the best way to talk about what the difference is.
Well, that was fabulous, Cathy. Thank you.
Well, I mean, again, they're the ones who would share that with me, and again, people really, they pick up on this after a while. They start to see the difference. They're like, because we're trained to get in there and, wrestle with it.
Yeah, I love how you point out that there's a difference between the principles and these other programs, but they're all pointing in the right direction.
Absolutely.
It's like the principles kind of drill down a little deeper to a more fundamental level so
Absolutely.
that it actually influences everything then that's not
Yeah,
quite as
yeah,
deep.
yeah.
Beautiful.
See, when people come to me and something's helped them, like I had a woman who, she was a hypnotherapist and she was learning the principles and she wanted to transition into working with principles only. And most of her clients were these high-powered tech people in Silicon Valley here. And they would come see her and she would hypnotize them and they would leave really, relaxed and, really feeling good. And so they would come to her once or twice, once a week, once every other week. And she wanted to be able to start teaching them the principles, but she wasn't quite sure about how do I make that transition. So I sat there and I thought, well, yeah, this would be an interesting thing to think about. So I said, well, why do they have to keep coming back? Do they tell you? I mean, why are they coming back? Well, they're coming back because after it wears off. After a week or so, it wears off. Well, and I asked her, well, why do you think it wears off? And she says, oh, I never thought of it that way. She's thinking the job is creating more stress. So they have to come in to be hypnotized to get out of the stress. What she finally realizes, oh, when their mind's relaxed with me and they go back into the world, a lot of the thinking comes back. See, they think it's their job or what's going on in their life. They don't realize it's their thinking that's creating the stress. So I said, well, that would be a nice place to teach them when they come back and ask them, well, do you ever wonder why you feel good for a few days, but then it wears off? Have you ever wondered about that? See, you could start there. And she said, I never thought of that. So if they could understand that the feeling they get from hypnosis, actually it's all she's doing is helping them clear their mind to feel something that's there already. And if they realize it's there, whether they're in stress mode or not, it's still there. If they realize that, then they wouldn't have to have somebody do something to them. They could have an understanding that allows them to at least point themselves in that direction. And that their understanding over time, they would spend less time in stress mode and more time in relax mode. See, when I first learned the principles, I lived in stress pressure mode and I would visit calm, relax mode. Since I've been around the principles, I live in calm, relax mode and I visit stress and intense mode. So I'd much rather visit than live in it. But that helped her know how to transition folks. And so the nature of the work, so you could invite them to say, well, instead of doing hypnosis, would you be open to learning something where you wouldn't need hypnosis? Now, how could you say no to that? So, good example.
Beautiful, Cathy. I think that really answers the question well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's great seeing both of you.
Yeah,
You too.
nice to be with you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye
Bye.
now.